The Black Stranger of Ramos. Winter descended upon the town of Ramos like a shroud, earlier than usual that year. The first snowfall dusted the rooftops and cobblestone streets by mid-October, and with it came an unnatural silence that hung in the air like a premonition. It was on such a day, when breath crystallized and the sun seemed to retreat behind a permanent veil of clouds, that he first appeared. No one remembered seeing him arrive. No bus had stopped at the local depot. No car had been spotted bringing him to town. He simply materialized one frigid morning on Main Street, a figure cut from darkness itself. Tall and lean, dressed entirely in black from his polished shoes to his immaculate jacket, he moved with the fluid grace of a shadow cast by no discernible source. His hair, raven black and precisely combed, framed a face too symmetrical to be comforting, too perfect to be natural. Only his eyes disrupted the monochrome presentation, blue, but not the warm blue of summer skies. Rather, they were the cold, distant blue of Arctic ice, seeming to absorb light without reflecting any warmth back into the world. The townspeople of Ramos, normally friendly to visitors in their remote mountain community, found themselves averting their gazes when he passed. Children, usually boisterous and curious about newcomers, fell silent and still as statues until he had moved beyond their sight. Dogs that would bark at passing cars became suddenly, unnaturally quiet, slinking away with tails between legs when his shadow fell across their path. This was not fear, not yet. It was something more primal, an instinctual recognition of something fundamentally wrong, like the sudden sense of vertigo when standing too close to a precipice. The first incident occurred at Clara's Cafe, a modest establishment that had served the people of Ramos for 3 generations. The stranger entered at precisely noon, when the lunch crowd was at its peak. The usual chatter died immediately, conversations snuffed out like candles in a gale. He chose a corner booth with a view of the entire dining area and sat with his back to the wall, posture unnaturally rigid. Martha, a waitress who had worked at Clara's for 20 years and was known for her friendly demeanor with even the most difficult customers, approached his table with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she set down a menu. "Welcome to Clara's," she managed, her voice steady enough to those who didn't know her well. The stranger said nothing, merely pointed to an item on the menu with a finger too long, too pale. The nails were perfectly manicured, yet somehow reminiscent of claws. Martha hurried away, relieved to escape his presence even momentarily. When she returned with his meal, a rare steak with potatoes, she forced herself to ask, "Can I get you anything else?" No response came. She returned once more as he was finishing, protocol demanding she check on her customer. "How was everything today?" she asked, the question slipping out automatically. The stranger looked up then, catching her eyes with his glacial gaze. His lips parted in what might have been a smile on another face, but on his was a grotesque stretching of skin over teeth too numerous, too sharp. Then, with deliberate slowness, he gathered a mouthful of half-chewed meat and spat it directly into Martha's face. The cafe fell dead silent. Not a fork clinked, not a breath was drawn. Without a word, the stranger stood, his height suddenly seeming impossible in the confines of the small establishment. He walked out, leaving his bill unpaid and Martha standing frozen, bits of bloody meat sliding down her cheek. That night, Martha developed a fever. By morning, angry red welts had erupted across her skin, weeping a clear fluid that hardened into crystalline structures unlike anything the local doctor had seen. By nightfall, her organs had begun to liquefy inside her still living body. Her screams echoed through the small community hospital until her vocal cords dissolved. She died 3 days later, her body unrecognizable, more crystalline sculpture than human remain. The official cause was listed as unknown pathogen, but the people of Ramos knew better. They had seen the stranger's eyes when he looked at Martha. They had seen something ancient and malevolent assess her worth and find her wanting. And they had seen him walking the streets later that same night, pausing to look up at the hospital window where Martha fought for her last breaths, that same not-quite smile playing across features that seemed less human with each passing day. The deaths that followed were equally inexplicable and horrific. Old Mr. Peterson, who had muttered "unnatural" as the stranger passed him on the street, was found the next morning frozen solid in his bed despite the temperature in his home being a balmy 72 degrees. His eyes were open, expression fixed in a rictus of absolute terror, as if in his final moments he had seen something beyond human comprehension. The Henderson child, who had innocently asked the stranger why he dressed like a scary man, disappeared for 3 days before being discovered in the town square, arranged in a sitting position against the central statue. The medical examiner found no blood left in the small body, not a drop, yet there were no wounds, no explanation for where it had gone. The most disturbing detail, whispered only between the closest of friends, was that the child's face bore an expression not of fear, but of serene acceptance, as if death had come as a merciful friend rather than a monstrous thief. With each new atrocity, the stranger's presence in town became more brazen, more proprietary. He could be seen standing motionless for hours at street corners, watching the comings and goings of terrified residents with those cold blue eyes. He would appear suddenly in shop windows, reflected behind customers who had been alone moments before, vanishing when they turned to look. And always, there was that terrible almost smile, as if he found the mounting fear of Ramos to be a particularly satisfying meal he was consuming one bite at a time. Word spread through Ramos with the speed of contagion. Cross the stranger, disappoint him in any way, and death would follow, not always swift, never merciful, but absolutely certain. Parents kept their children indoors. Businesses began closing early, the streets emptied by dusk, though few found sleep in the long, dark nights that followed. Sheriff Daniels, a Vietnam veteran who had prided himself on 30 years without a single unsolved case in Ramos, found himself powerless. No evidence connected the stranger to the deaths. Indeed, no evidence explained the deaths at all. When Daniels attempted to question the stranger, approaching him outside the town's only hotel where he supposedly had taken a room, though the night clerk would later swear no key had ever been issued, no registration form ever signed, the lawman found himself unable to speak. Later, he would describe it as if some cold hand had reached down his throat and frozen his words before they could form. He stood there, mute and trembling, as the stranger regarded him with something approaching amusement in those terrible eyes. The next day, Sheriff Daniels tendered his resignation and left town, his hair turned completely white overnight. It was at Joe's Bar and Grill, the last establishment still serving alcohol after dark, that the plan was born. 6 men, Robert Carson the butcher, Michael Weiss the high school football coach, brothers Thomas and James Harker who owned the local hardware store, Dr. Peter Lansky, and Father Matthew from St. Augustine's Church, gathered in the corner booth furthest from the windows. They spoke in whispers, though the bar was empty save for Joe himself, who kept the glasses filled and asked no questions. Each man had lost someone to the stranger's apparent displeasure. Each had seen the impossible, faced the unthinkable, and each had reached the same conclusion. Whatever the stranger was, he wore the shape of a man. And what looked like a man could be killed like one. They made their plan over whiskey and fear. They would follow him until he entered one of the abandoned areas of town, where the old mill had closed down decades ago. There they would surround him with weapons concealed beneath long coats, Weiss with his baseball bat, the Harker brothers with crowbars from their store, Carson with his butcher's cleaver, Dr. Lansky with a surgical saw, and Father Matthew, God forgive him, with a broken table leg driven through with nails. They would not give him a chance to spit or stare or smile that terrible smile. They would beat him until whatever unholy life animated him fled back to whatever dark corner of hell had spawned it. The opportunity came 3 nights later. The stranger was observed leaving the town's only bookstore at dusk, a package wrapped in brown paper under his arm. The 6 men followed at a distance, communicating with hand signals practiced in Joe's back room. When the stranger turned down the cobblestone path leading to the abandoned mill, they quickened their pace. The sky above was moonless, clouds obscuring stars, as if nature itself conspired to hide what was about to occur. The stranger stopped in the mill's empty courtyard, standing perfectly still, his back to his pursuers. Later, those who investigated would wonder if he had known all along, if he had led them there deliberately, like sheep to slaughter. But in that moment, the 6 men saw only opportunity as they closed the circle around their prey. It was Coach Weiss who struck first, his baseball bat whistling through the air toward the stranger's head with enough force to shatter bone. The stranger moved then, not to dodge, but to turn, to face his attacker with that same almost smile. The bat connected with his temple with a sound like wood striking marble. The stranger did not fall. He did not bleed. He did not even blink those terrible blue eyes. And then, as if some invisible signal had been given, all 6 men fell upon him in a frenzy of violence, weapons rising and falling in a desperate, primal rhythm. They struck him with such force that their own hands blistered and bled. They screamed as they attacked, their voices rising to drown out the thundering of their own hearts. And through it all, the stranger stood, absorbing their rage and fear like a black hole absorbs light, until finally, mercifully, he crumpled to the ground beneath their blows. They did not stop then, could not stop. They continued their assault until their arms grew leaden and their breath came in ragged gasps. Only when the stranger's body had been reduced to a dark, unrecognizable mass on the cobblestones did they finally step back, weapons dripping, faces spattered with what they assumed was blood but which felt too cold, too viscous against their skin. They did not speak as they departed, each man returning to his home in silence, washing away the evidence of their crime with water that never seemed to run warm enough to chase away the chill that had settled in their bones. Dawn broke over Ramos with a sickly, jaundiced light. The town awoke to screams, first from the mill district, then spreading outward as the news traveled from house to house. 6 bodies had been discovered scattered throughout town, each displayed in a manner that defied explanation and offended sanity. Robert Carson hung suspended from meat hooks in his own butcher shop window, his body expertly dressed as he would prepare a pig carcass, his organs arranged on trays below with handwritten price tags. Coach Weiss was found on the football field, his body driven into the ground like a human stake, his baseball bat protruding from his mouth and extending 3 feet behind his shattered skull. The Harker brothers were discovered in their hardware store, their bodies meticulously disassembled and the parts mingled together, then reassembled into a grotesque approximation of a single, larger human form, bolted together with items from their own shelves. Dr. Lansky lay on his own operating table, his body split vertically from groin to skull with surgical precision, pinned open like a butterfly in a display case, every organ labeled in perfect handwriting with Latin terminology. And Father Matthew, God rest his soul, was found crucified upon the doors of his own church, the table leg he had carried driven through his heart, his eyes replaced with communion wafers, his mouth stuffed with pages from the Bible, each selected from Revelation. None had died quickly. Evidence suggested that each man had remained conscious through most of their ordeal, experiencing every moment of their methodical destruction. That same morning, as police from neighboring counties poured into Ramos and news vans clogged the once quiet streets, the stranger was seen walking calmly down Main Street. His black clothes were immaculate, his pale face unmarred, his blue eyes clear and cold as ever. He nodded politely to the out-of-town officers, who nodded back, seeing only a well-dressed young man, remarkably ordinary save for his height and the intensity of his gaze. The people of Ramos, however, pressed themselves against walls or ducked into shops when they saw him coming. They knew what the outsiders could not, that the pleasant-looking man in black, who appeared to be about 30 with his innocent expression and perfect posture, was something other than human, something that wore humanity like an ill-fitting suit. The local newspaper, in its last edition before the editor fled town permanently, described the killings as the work of a serial killer of unprecedented sophistication, though they carefully avoided connecting them to the stranger. No one in Ramos was willing to point a finger, to speak the truth. To acknowledge the stranger was to risk drawing his attention, and his attention was a death sentence whose only variables were timing and method. The following Sunday, the stranger attended the morning service at St. Augustine's Church, now led by a nervous young priest sent by the diocese to replace Father Matthew. The stranger sat in the last pew, head bowed respectfully during prayers, voice blending melodiously with the congregation during hymns. His presence emptied the church of regular parishioners, who invented illnesses and obligations to avoid sharing sacred space with him. Only out-of-towners, relatives visiting for funerals, and a few elderly residents too set in their routines to break them remained. The service proceeded without incident, though the young priest stuttered through his sermon and dropped the communion chalice twice, spilling consecrated wine across the altar cloth like an omen. That evening, As a much smaller congregation gathered for the evening service, witnesses reported seeing the stranger standing across the street, watching the church with that now familiar almost smile. At 7:42 p.m., as the service reached its conclusion, United Airlines Flight 823, experiencing catastrophic instrument failure, veered 70 miles off course and plummeted directly into St. Augustine's Church. The impact and subsequent explosion leveled the historic building and killed all 53 people within. Subsequent investigation would determine the cause to be equipment malfunction of unknown origin, though electrical engineers brought in to examine the recovered black box would resign rather than sign their names to such an explanation. They had seen the data, seen the impossibility of every instrument failing simultaneously, seen the cockpit recording where both pilots, in their final moments, described seeing a tall, pale face with blue eyes pressed against the cockpit window at 37,000 feet, smiling that terrible almost smile as it reached through solid glass to touch the control panels. The disaster made national headlines. CNN, Fox News, and every major network descended upon Ramos, transforming the tragedy into a 24-hour spectacle of grief and speculation. Through it all, the stranger walked the streets openly, occasionally appearing in the background of live broadcasts, always facing the camera with that knowing expression, visible to viewers at home who called stations in droves to report the creepy guy in black. Journalists who attempted to interview him found their equipment malfunctioning, their questions evaporating from their minds upon approach. The people of Ramos, those who remained, knew the truth that could never be reported. The church's destruction was a demonstration, a flex of power from something playing with them as a cat plays with wounded mice. And still, no authority connected the stranger to any wrongdoing. No evidence existed. No proof could be found. He was merely a tall, well-dressed man who happened to be present in a town experiencing a statistically impossible sequence of tragedies. 3 days after the church disaster, flyers appeared throughout Ramos, printed on paper so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The message, in elegant white script, was simple. A community meeting will be held tonight at the Ramos High School auditorium. Attendance is mandatory for all residents. Your future depends upon it. No signature was needed. The people of Ramos knew who had summoned them, just as they knew the cost of disobedience. By 7 o'clock that evening, the auditorium was filled beyond capacity, over 800 people packed into seats designed for 500. The air was thick with fear and anticipation. At precisely 7:30, the stranger walked onto the stage, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. For the first time since his arrival in Ramos, he spoke directly to the assembled townspeople, his voice melodious and reasonable, like a concerned neighbor discussing a minor civic issue. "Good people of Ramos," he began, hands clasped before him like a schoolteacher addressing beloved students, "I want to thank you for your hospitality these past weeks. It's rare for me to find a community so receptive to my presence." A soft chuckle escaped his lips, the sound of ice cracking on a frozen lake. "But all visits must come to an end, and my time here is concluded. I came to make a study of you, to understand the dynamics of fear and faith in an isolated population. You have been most educational." He paused, those blue eyes sweeping across the crowd, seeming to meet each person's gaze individually despite the impossibility. "As a token of my appreciation, I will leave you with a parting gift. Something to remember me by. Something that will ensure Ramos remains in the thoughts and prayers of the nation for generations to come." With that, he offered a small bow, and left the stage with unhurried steps. No one moved to stop him. No voice rose in question or protest. They sat frozen in their seats long after the auditorium doors closed behind him, paralyzed by the dreadful knowledge that whatever gift he had promised, it would be neither kind nor merciful. For 2 weeks, the people of Ramos waited. Some fled, packing whatever they could carry and driving through the night, though many reported seeing a tall figure in black standing along the roadside at the town limits, watching their departure with that terrible almost smile. Most stayed, trapped by obligations, poverty, or the fatalistic belief that whatever the stranger had planned would find them regardless of distance. When nothing happened, a fragile hope began to emerge. Perhaps the stranger's words had been empty threats, a final psychological torture before he moved on to some new town, some fresh hunting ground. Perhaps Ramos had been spared. That hope died at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, when the nuclear power plant 15 miles outside town, a facility with safety records so pristine it had been featured in industry publications, experienced what official reports would later call a cascading series of system failures without precedent in the history of nuclear energy. Failsafe after failsafe collapsed. Backup systems activated and immediately malfunctioned. The core began to melt down despite the frantic efforts of engineers who would later describe seeing tall shadows where no one stood, hearing whispers in empty rooms, finding safety protocols rewritten in elegant script they couldn't remember authorizing. By dawn, radiation levels had already exceeded those recorded at Chernobyl. The evacuation order came too late for most of Ramos. Wind patterns carried the invisible poison directly over the town, saturating homes and businesses, seeping into water supplies and soil. Those who weren't killed in the initial exposure died slowly over the following months, their bodies betrayed by cellular mutation, their deaths documented by hazmat-suited medical teams for future case studies. Today, Ramos exists only as a footnote in textbooks on nuclear disasters, a cautionary tale of regulatory failure and technological hubris. The town itself stands empty, a modern American Pompeii where time stopped suddenly one autumn morning. Houses remain with breakfast dishes on tables, cars sit in driveways with keys in ignitions, as if the population simply vanished between one breath and the next. No one lives within 50 miles of the contamination zone. No one is permitted to visit without special clearance and protective gear. But truckers passing on distant highways sometimes report a strange sight in the pre-dawn hours, a tall figure in black, walking the empty streets of Ramos as if taking a pleasant morning stroll. Park rangers and environmental monitors speak in hushed tones of a man they've glimpsed standing motionless among the abandoned buildings, always facing in the direction of their observation posts, always wearing that terrible almost smile. And across the country, in small towns much like Ramos once was, residents occasionally notice a newcomer, tall, well-dressed in black, with cold blue eyes that seem to measure and assess everyone they fall upon. They notice how dogs grow quiet when he passes, how children turn suddenly shy, how conversations stop when he enters a room. But these observations are rarely shared, rarely connected. After all, what is there to say? That a stranger has come to town, that he seems odd, perhaps unfriendly. Such concerns sound foolish when spoken aloud. Better to smile politely and look away. Better to hope that when his terrible attention falls upon someone, it falls upon someone else. Better to pretend not to see him at all, the stranger with the perfect face and the cold, cold eyes, the man who might be a man or might be something else entirely, walking patiently through the human world, selecting his next Ramos with the deliberate care of a connoisseur choosing the perfect wine to complement his meal.